June 1942. Two bombs fall in silence, then a rip of fire crawls up a riverbank where a bridge had stood. Somewhere below, a German sergeant shouts a new name for the ghostly raiders, Nachthexen, night witches. He swears he hears broomsticks. There are no broomsticks. There are young women in open cockpits, cheeks numb from the cold, flying biplanes that the world thought belonged to flight schools, not to war. This is the story of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the all-women Soviet unit that turned curiosity into terror, wooden airplanes into instruments of precision, and midnight into a weapon all its own. They were told there was no place for them at the front. Within months, they would become the most relentless night bombers of the Eastern Front, log tens of thousands of sorties, earn the coveted Guards title, and, in the words of those who watched searchlights crisscross the sky and flak-chase shadows, make darkness itself feel haunted. The pivot begins far from the front lines, in the corridors of a Soviet command reeling from disaster. Kiev has fallen. Smolensk has fallen. The Wehrmacht rolls east, and the Red Army is bleeding. In this chaos steps a pilot and national icon, Major Marina Raskova, navigator, record setter, and, above all, relentless advocate. She has already coaxed feats out of machines many thought impossible. Now she aims to coax an army to accept an idea it has repeatedly resisted. Women in combat cockpits, not as exceptions, not as curiosities, but as a unit, trained and equipped to fight. On October 8, 1941, with Raskova's push and the government's need converging, Order No. 0099 authorizes 3 all-women aviation regiments. Engels, on the Volga, becomes their crucible. The new regiments will be a fighter unit, the 586th, a bomber unit, the 587th, and a night bomber unit, the 588th. Their aircraft? Not sleek monoplane fighters or heavy twin-engine bombers, but Polikarpov U-2s, later designated Po-2s wood and fabric biplanes, conceived for training and liaison work. Perfect for students, laughable for war. Unless, Raskova argues, war is smart enough to harness their stealth. The women arrive in Engels in a stream of wool coats and earnest faces. Many are teenagers, some left conservatories and universities, others mechanical courses or farm fields. They will become pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers, and radio operators. Under a regime that compresses years into months, they drill until their shoulders ache and the numbers blur. They learn to handle the U-2's quirks and kindnesses. It is forgiving, simple, so light that a gust can lift a wingtip when carelessness cannot. They learn the crafts no one celebrates but everyone needs, how to rig a bomb mount, lace a control cable, replace a spark plug in the dark, with hands too cold to feel. They learn the mathematics of night, drift and wind, dead reckoning without landmarks, reading the earth by touch of shadow, by the pale scarf of a river, by the pinprick pattern of village lamps muffled for blackout. They learn how to trust the little things, a luminous compass card, a pencil snapped down the middle to share, the dog-eared chart with a grease pencil line that will be corrected and corrected again as the wind smears a course into something that can be flown. Deployment follows training like thunder follows heat. The Southern Front needs everything, and the 588th is everything the book says a bomber regiment should not be. Slow, unarmored, underpowered. Yet the missions that begin in June 1942 are exactly the missions these planes can do. Short-range, low-altitude harassment raids against bridges, supply dumps, river crossings, rail nodes, and frontline positions. Their first recorded combat flight over the Mias River sets the template. They leave in the dusk, fly in 2s and 3s, approach low, kill their engines, glide, drop, and vanish into blackness. This cuts two ways. The pilot flies blind on touch and instinct in the last seconds. The navigator eyes glued to map and stopwatch. Whispers corrections and calls the drop. The result is a bomb arriving like a held breath released. The Po-2s carry modest loads, often two 50-kilogram bombs slung beneath the lower wing, sometimes clusters of small incendiaries, but they carry them again and again. The arithmetic of the 588th is persistence. If a fighter regiment measures success in sorties per month, the Night Witches will measure in sorties per night. 8 flights. 10 on desperate nights, 12 or more. They take off, bomb, land, refuel, rearm, go again. The grass strip becomes a seam of light and noise, mechanics hustling with handcarts and fuel drums, armorers hefting bombs to cradles, pilots gulping black tea that tastes like smoke. Everything is done with speed and without fuss. They do not waste words because the night is short and the targets many. Unit Commander Yevdokia Bershanskaya, calm, precise, hard to rattle, builds a rhythm out of exhaustion. She knows the strength of her regiment is not the airplane. It is the system that turns raw will into repetition. Pilots and navigators are matched not only by skill, but by complement. Some women have eyes that read the dark. Some have hands that never over-control an aircraft that demands gentle touch. Some can hear the Po-2's M11 engine and know by pitch which cylinder needs attention. Bershanskaya demands they become interchangeable in the sky and indivisible on the ground. The Battle of the Caucasus opens a deep wound through the south. German panzers seek the oil of the Maikop fields, the passes to the Black Sea and beyond. The 588th moves where bridges become lifelines and supply dumps are the difference between defense and collapse. They strike across the foothills, Prokladnaya, Digora, the approach routes around Mozdok and Orjonikidze. Low clouds, mountain winds, and the cruel arithmetic of distance press the pilots. They begin to fly where the few trees are the only cover. When the Luftwaffe sends night fighters to wait above likely routes and searchlights lance the dark, the women adapt. Two tactics take hold. First, the decoy pair. One aircraft comes in just high enough to be seen and felt, clattering engine aimed to attract attention, to draw up the searchlights and flak as if it is the only threat. While the sky shouts at that ghost, the second drifts in at treetop height, engine off, a blacker shadow against black, to finish the job. Second, the carousel. A string of Po-2s circle at the edge of a target area, like beads on a wire, each diving in turn while others hold and wait. It stretches a raid from minutes to an hour or more, bleeding defenders of sleep and nerve. The German response grows sharper. Night fighters prowl, Bf-110s and Ju-88s, hunting by sound and silhouette, sometimes guided by searchlight clusters coordinated for a cone of light that traps prey like a spider's web. Yet the Po-2's apparent weaknesses become their armor. A fast interceptor overshoots and overshoots again. The wooden body that would shatter under a heavy round is also a poor radar target. At speeds scarcely above a car's, the biplane hangs awkwardly where a fighter cannot. There is no romance in this. The pilots still die when luck runs thin. But more often than anyone predicted, the little planes live in the margins where the big hunters cannot bite. Recognition comes in the language the Red Army understands: orders and honorifics. In February 1943, the 588th becomes the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment Guards status, reserved for units that have proved exceptional in combat. The new title confirms what the women have already sensed in bone-deep fatigue and unyielding resolve, that the front has accepted them not as an experiment, but as a weapon. The Guards badge is sewn onto wool. For a moment, on the step, there is pride that warms like vodka. The winter has been brutal. Pilots fly in sheepskin coats and boots too big, fingers numb inside thick gloves that make delicate control a test of will. They stuff scarves in boots, slip newspapers under shirts, tie handkerchiefs over noses to keep frost at bay. They endure because the aircraft offers no shelter. An open cockpit is not a place to hide. In the gray dawn after a raid, they look like ghosts, faces rimed with frost, eyes raw from wind. They sleep when they can, on planks, on bundled canvas, on anything that will take the weight of a body wrung dry. And then they wake when the order comes again. The Kuban bridgehead becomes the anvil on which the regiment hammers night after night. Along the Taman Peninsula, where the Black Sea meets the Sea of Azov, German forces cling to a fortified foothold. The 46th Guards flies sorties that feel like a siege, wearing down defenses with persistence. Their operations expand in scope and credibility. Artillery commanders call for specific targets to be struck at precise hours, bridges when columns are scheduled to cross, depots before relief trains arrive. Partisan reports feed them intelligence. The coordination demands a new discipline. The whoosh of a PO-2 gliding in must be synchronized with a battery's barrage or an infantry probe, or the effect is lost. There are names that become talismans in a regiment bound by superstition as much as by schedule. Irina Sibrova, navigator-turned-pilot, racks up over 1,000 sorties, an unthinkable number until one does not count by days, but by nights, and a night can hold 9 or 10 trips. Nadezhda Popova, who flies with an intensity others call reckless, but she would call necessary, will later total more than 800 sorties. Polina Gelman, a navigator whose calm becomes a silver thread through chaos, who will be awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest distinction. Marina Chechneva, whose post-war memoirs will carry the rhythm of these nights, though in the moment there is no memoir, only the next takeoff. Many others, faces that flicker in lantern light, hands with cuts and oil stains that never quite wash out, a kind of laughter that knows it should be saved but comes anyway when a mission returns, and there is a moment to breathe. Not all return. The squadron gathers quietly when the order comes to form up by the runway. They hear the names of those who did not walk back, a plane seen to dive beyond a tree line, a flare that never lit, a wing that did not answer a turn. There are pilots lost to flak, to fighters, to weather, to the invisible line where fatigue turns mistake into accident. They bury what they can. Sometimes they cannot. They fly anyway. The next target is already marked on the worn map with a new circle in red. the Taman Peninsula falls. The regiment receives the honorific Taman, and with it, a new identity in the roll call of the Air Army. The 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Honorifics in the Soviet tradition are not decoration, they are geography welded to unit memory. From that point on, whenever the name is spoken, the Black Sea winds and the burned bridges of Taman ride along. There is relief in victory, but there is no rest. The line moves west, and the women move with it, along airstrips that look identical at midnight, but carry the scents and shadows of new places. Salt marsh, pine, clay dust, a whiff of rotting ballast where the rails have been torn. Crimea is a test of concentration. The points of attack multiply, Sevastopol's batteries, Simferopol's depots, the web of roads that channel German withdrawals. The Po-2s scatter along Coast Guard strips and hastily scraped fields, bringing in bombs like ants, bring grit, piece by piece, until a hill is built. They work with frontline artillery and armored spearheads, disrupting counter-moves in the night so the morning can press forward. The regimen remains relentless. A typical night begins before dusk. A briefing in a tent, the pilot and navigator bent over charts scratched with charcoal, the mechanic checking cable tension and tank levels, the armorer with a cigarette dangling as she, in this regiment, hoists bombs onto the cradle and checks the safety wires. When the light fades, the strip becomes a corridor of dark and sound. Engines cough, then catch, then thrum. The Po-2 leaps into the air after a short run, like a horse that does not need to be asked twice. The navigator watches the stopwatch as if it were a living thing, counting back the wind's theft of time. Over the target, the routines lead to improvisations that make the difference between shaking and shattering a position. They learn to spot a camouflaged battery by the telltale square shadow of a gun pit at moonrise. They learn to hear the difference between flak aimed close and flak meant to scare. They learn that it is sometimes better to drop one bomb and go than to risk the second when the angles are wrong. Discipline becomes the mother of luck. When a night fighter appears, a looming darkness behind and below, the sudden twin flares of cannon. There is little an unarmed biplane can do. The pilots shove the stick forward and skim the treetops, pray for a fog bank, yank the little plane into turns that make the wing wires sing. Sometimes it is enough. The fighter pilot curses, the sight vanishes. There are reports of German pilots wrecking their planes, chasing a Po-2 too low into terrain, or stalling in a slow-speed fight. And there are times in the morning when the mechanics look at a Po-2 on the grass and count the holes stitched through the fabric like a tailor's pattern, and they patch, and it flies again that night. The regiment moves north and west, crossing into Belarus and Poland as the Red Army's momentum becomes avalanche. The targets change with the geography. More rail lines, more junctions, more long stretches of road where retreat turns to rout. They begin to strike deeper on nights when the front is quiet and scouting reports have built a case for a depot or headquarters behind the lines. This brings new dangers. Searchlight belts grow denser, night fighters are more frequent, but the women have learned new ways to be invisible. They use rivers as navigation spines and black out marks, then slide off at the last moment to approach from an unexpected angle. They trade altitudes and headings in whispers. They mark friendly lines with special signals to avoid tragedy. The system becomes a choreography. The myth-making begins even before the war ends. German troops, exhausted and sleepless, curse the witches that trickle death into their nights. The origin legend broomstick's whooshing is less romantic in reality. The sound that spooks men is physics: engine to idle, prop windmilling, fabric in wind. The women do not complain if the name spreads fear. Fear is part of the calculus of war. Back in Moscow, planners weigh the value of night harassment bombing. It is not a decisive arm like a tank corps. It does not shift the front alone. It does something more subtle. It amplifies everything else. It breaks a bridge that an engineer company must now rush to repair under the risk of another visit. It craters a road that slows a redeployment by hours that cannot be spared. It prevents sleep the night before an attack, which changes how men shoot and move. And, most essentially, it announces to every German sentry that the dark is not his, that it belongs to women he cannot see until it is too late. Winter, 1944-45. The unit follows the front into East Pomerania and beyond. Winter again, and again the struggle against elements. Mechanics bleed from cracked knuckles wrenched by cold. Pilots lose skin from fingertips when they try to adjust a map clip without a glove in a slipstream below freezing. There are stories that border on unbelievable until one knows how stubbornness and routine can make exceptions into normal. A crew returns with one cylinder firing, the engine coughing like a dying animal, and lands on a strip barely longer than a cricket pitch, because there is no choice. A navigator uses a matchstick, the head ground off in her mouth to hold the pencil in place against the chart, while her numb hands rest even for a second. A pilot throws her plane into a climb it has no right to make to clear a line of poplars, and the wingtip brushes leaves that smell like iron in the cold. In the morning, it seems like a miracle. In the night, it was only necessary. The casualty lists are not astronomical like those of frontline rifle divisions, but each loss shakes a unit held together by trust. There are 30, more or fewer as records are compiled, names written down, medals awarded. The awards matter not because of medal and ribbon, but because they fix stories in place. 23 women of the regiment are named heroes of the Soviet Union. Some of the recipients will live to old age and speak to school children about maps and engines and clouds. Others will never know the title attached to their names. March-May 1945. The war's end approaches like a storm seen over a plain, the line of black cloud at the horizon, the charged air, the sense that what has been routine will soon be gone. The regiment bombs the last nodes of resistance in Pomerania and the approaches to the Oder. They do not bomb Berlin, not in this unit with these planes. That assignment falls to heavies and special missions. Their work remains what it always was: unglamorous, relentless, vital. When the guns finally fall silent, the ritual that has bound these women for years breaks in an instant. The planes that were instruments of war become artifacts. The crews stand on a runway and listen to quiet in a way that makes the scalp tingle. They hug without ceremony. They drink. They sleep. Some will stay in aviation. Many will not. The uniforms go into trunks. The skills reading a river in the dark, hearing an engine's mood, wielding fatigue like a tool seem, for a time, like things no longer needed. And then life arrives and finds uses for them after all. The numbers, when compiled, provoke envy and disbelief. The regiment flew over 23,000 sorties. They dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs. They operated continuously from 1942 to 1945 across some of the most contested ground on the Eastern Front. They became the most decorated women's aviation unit in Soviet history. They were entirely female: pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers, the spine that kept it all moving. Their regimental commander, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, led from formation to victory with a steadiness that appears, in hindsight, like inevitability. It was anything but. Who they were in detail makes the story breathe. Consider a few of the many. Nadezhda Popova learned to fly as a teenager and brought to combat a poise that teetered at the edge of audacity. She would remember nights when anti-aircraft fire stitched her wings and she pressed on because the target must be hit, because others, her own infantry below, were counting on this small cut in the enemy's skin to keep blood flowing in the right direction. By war's end, she had flown more than 800 sorties, 852 by some counts, and survived because she learned when to push and when to live for the next run. Irina Sebrova began in the navigator's seat, where mathematics and intuition dance. She transitioned to the pilot's stick and wrote her own math into the war with more than 1,000 sorties. Those numbers are not an abstraction. They are the arc of a young life drawn again and again across the night sky, backwards and forwards until the line became a net that caught the enemy's strength and shook it. Polina Gelman, a navigator famed for cool precision, served across major campaigns and earned the hero of the Soviet Union for achievements that were less about a single act than about a constancy that permitted many acts by many others. She remained in service after the war, a living bridge between memory and the institution. Yevdokia Nosal, one of the early casualties, became a symbol of courage. She died in 1943 and was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously. Her name circulated in the regiment with a kind of fierce gentleness, the way a unit holds on to those it has lost. Marina Chechneva returned to the world and wrote, turning nights of work into pages that help us hear the thrum of the M11 and feel the tug of the stick in a turn. Her recollections unsettle the imagination in the best way. They normalize the extraordinary, which is what a regiment must do to survive its own task. And there were dozens more whose stories flicker like street lamps in a fog. Visible once and then gone back into the gray. Mechanics who stole minutes of sleep leaning against wheel struts. Armorers who learned to trust their own hands because a bomb that did not fall when commanded could cost lives. Radio operators whose equipment was sparse, these PO2s often flew without radios, but who managed ground coordination with a kind of telepathy born of routine. Administrators who made fuel appear, meals happen, repairs get done. The invisible network that lets a pilot lift off and know she will have ground under her wheels when she returns. Of their aircraft it is worth speaking in more than derision. The Polikarpov PO2 was, on paper, obsolete. A 5-cylinder radial engine of modest power, a top speed that would not shame a car, fabric stretched over wooden ribs and struts, and yet it could take off from a field a cow might cross, land on a strip barely rolled, and be patched with glue and cloth by hands that belonged to the same people who flew it. It was forgiving in stall and gentle in turn, as if it understood that young pilots would need mercy in the night. Its simplicity was its strength. An aluminum monocoque gives nothing back when hit. Wood flexes and sometimes holds. Tactics made the plane a weapon. The approach on idle to cut noise not only terrified troops, it improved accuracy, letting the pilot feel the ground through the controls. Flying low turned searchlights into blinders that could not look down without losing their own focus. Speed was a friend when it could be, but slowness could be its own kind of stealth moving where defenders did not expect movement to be. The regiment's efficiency grew out of a system. Sortie generation is the hidden war fought behind the line of takeoff. In a single night, a crew might fly 10 missions, each no more than 15 to 30 minutes to the target, a few minutes to set up the final run, then a return and turnaround measured in slivers of time. Fuel must be there. Bombs must be there. Engines must fire, not near enough, but now. Weather demands constant watch. Wind drift corrections must be recomputed as the night cools and patterns shift. This is drudgery elevated to art. Bershanskaya's gift was to turn these tasks into a rolling factory of missions that poured out of a grass strip and into history. Much of their legend is earned. Some is embroidered. It is said that German pilots were promised iron crosses for any PO-2 they shot down. There is no solid evidence for such a blanket bounty. It reads like the kind of rumor the defeated cherish to make sense of an irritant. It is said that the women flew without parachutes because they were too heavy for the fragile planes. In truth, parachutes were sometimes not worn because of low altitudes where a jump would be futile anyway, and sheer practicality in crowded cockpits. At other times, they were worn. Reality is always messier than myth, and the truth that they flew into flak in open cockpits night after night is sufficient. Their acceptance was not smooth. Many male units resented sharing scarce resources with women they saw as unproven. There were snide comments about lipstick and curls, as if femininity could not coexist with duty. The women adapted. They cut their hair, wore uniforms that did not fit, and proved competence in the only currency that matters to the military: results. By late 1942 and into 1943, the skepticism had largely burned off. Shared risk has a way of stripping pretense. Infantry batmen offered coffee at dawn. Artillery coordinators argued for the best targets like jealous directors. A downed Po-2 could bring a flood of volunteers to help drag it back to safety under fire because its pilots had been there for them through countless nights. Memory is a battlefield of its own. In the Soviet Union, the Night Witches became emblematic of wartime sacrifice and egalitarian fervor. In the West, slow to recognize Soviet contributions, they were rediscovered later. Their story wrapped in fascination with a war fought in silhouettes on a front that the Anglophone world too often ignored. Their legacy has endured because it satisfies the hunger for a clear moral arc. Women denied opportunity prove themselves indispensable and brave, then rewrite the terms on which they are judged. It endures, too, because it is technically interesting. A study in how to use tools not for what they were designed, but for what is possible. In military academies, case studies on the Eastern Front rarely feature biplanes. Yet there is doctrine hidden in the habits of the 46th Guards. It shows how harassment deepens attrition. It shows how a small unit with high sortie rates can punch above its weight in operational effect. It shows how to use terrain and darkness to produce tactical advantage from strategic poverty. It shows how leadership matters when technology does not save you, And it shows that discipline, the discipline to fly again when you are tired, to check a bolt when your hands tremble, to speak calmly when the searchlights sweep, can be as destructive to an enemy as any explosive. The names of campaigns are the stages of their play: Mius, the Caucasus, Kuban, Taman, Crimea, Belarus, Poland, Pomerania. In each, the pattern repeats with local flavors. The nights over the Mius smell like river mud and cordite. Over the Caucasus, like pine and snow. Over Taman, like salt and burnt rubber. Over Crimea, like dust. Over Poland, like damp earth and smoke. The changes are real, but the core is always the same. A small plane in a big sky, a crew locked in a common task, a bomb run that must be flown at the right angle and speed, a turn for home with the engine back to full, a landing on a strip that looks like every strip, and yet is the one that matters because it means you can go again. If you ask how women whom no one wanted to enlist became the most feared night bombers of the war, the answer comes in layers. First, a political opening at a moment of national crisis let Marina Raskova pry open a door. Without order number 0099, there is no 508th. Without her insistence, there is no experiment large enough to matter. The first step in every story of institutional change is a single person with enough credibility to make an exception become a rule. Second, training that compressed time without giving up standards built competence fast. Engels did not produce geniuses, it produced professionals. The women arrived at the front not as dabblers, but as crews who could take a mission order and execute it. Third, the choice of aircraft, dismissed by many as a mistake, proved wise for the mission. Night harassment requires many flights at short ranges with quick turnarounds and the ability to operate from marginal airstrips. Heavy bombers cannot do that. Advanced fighters are wasted at it. The PO-2 was perfect precisely because it was simple. Fourth, leadership turned potential into performance. Bershanskaya is not a glamorous figure in popular culture. She is no flamboyant ace. But she did the hard, unphotogenic work of converting fuel, bombs, and hours into destroyed targets. Fifth, the women themselves, collectively and individually, refused to be defined by the expectations of others. They grew hard without losing humanity, technical without losing imagination, disciplined without losing the humor that keeps a unit alive in long winters. And finally, the enemy contributed to the legend by fearing them. Fear is a force multiplier. Once German soldiers believed the night belonged to witches, every rustle became a warning, every searchlight sweep a confession of vulnerability, every sleepless hour a loss that would be felt in the morning. When the war was done, some of the women returned to universities and laboratories, to factories and families. Others remained in uniforms as instructors or in civil aviation, carrying the habits of the cockpit into peacetime skies. The official history recorded their honors, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union among them, a Guards banner, the Taman honorific stitched into the fabric of their name. The unofficial history stories swapped over tea with friends or told to children before bed recorded something else. The feel of ice on a glove, the thump of a clean landing in the dark, the smell of hot oil, the map lines that still appear behind the eyelids when one closes them, the comrades who pause in memory at strange hours. There is a temptation to coat their story with a sheen of inevitability. Do not. The night witches triumphed not because fate wrapped them in romance, but because they did the work. They insisted, trained, adapted, endured, and flew. They turned an insult into a title of honor. They forced a modern war to admit that technology is not everything, that courage and skill and a refusal to yield can transmute inferior equipment into superior results. They proved that when the lights go out, those who have mastered the night write what happens next. June 1942, May 1945. From the first gliding approaches over the Meuse to the last runs over Pomeranian roads, the arc is clear. They were told no. They answered yes. They became what the enemy named them, and in doing so, they made the night theirs. And if you still think the whisper you heard was the wind, listen again. It is a biplane on idle, a navigator counting down seconds, a pilot easing the nose for one clean run, a regiment that will fly again before you can light another cigarette. It is the sound of a war being rewritten, one silent drop at a time. Epilogue, the ledger and the legacy, formation, ordered. October 8, 1941, organized in Engels, commanded in combat by Yevdokia Bershanskaya. Aircraft, Polikarpov PO-2, U-2, wood and fabric biplane with a 5-cylinder M11 radial engine, low stall speed, short takeoff and landing, simple maintenance. Methods, night harassment bombing, engine idle glide to target, decoy pair and carousel tactics, coordination with artillery and ground forces. Campaigns, Southern Front, June 1942, Caucasus, late 1942, Kuban and Taman, spring-autumn 1943, earning Guards in February and Taman in October, Crimea, spring 1944, Belarus and Poland, mid-late 1944, East Pomerania and beyond, winter-spring 1945. Achievements: over 23,000 sorties, more than 3,000 tons of bombs dropped, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union from the regiment, one of the most decorated women's units in the Soviet Air Force. Cost: dozens killed, countless nights spent at the edge of endurance, a generation's worth of courage spent in 3 years. Their story has been told and retold because it is both singular and universal. Singular in the particulars of the Po-2's whisper, of canvas and frost and luminous compasses, universal in the way a group of people refused to be denied their share of the fight and, having won it, performed so well that even their enemies had to give them a name that sounded like fear. August 1942. For the sentry who first said it, perhaps it was just a curse thrown into the wind. For history, it was a confession. The night belonged to witches, and the witches flew.